I just told you a little while ago, these leaders that they call leaders, this included Lena Horne, this included Dick Gregory, and this included comedians, comics, trumpet players, baseball players. Show me in the white community where a comedian is a white leader. Show me in the white community where a singer is a white leader, or a dancer or a trumpet player is a white leader. These aren't leaders. These are puppets and clowns that have been set up over the white community and over the black community by the white community and have been made celebrities and usually say exactly what they know that the white man wants to hear.
No, nobody said it like Malcolm. And that's what makes this man so special. That was one of my all-time favorite Malcolm quotes, and that is saying a lot. Now, for those of you who don't know, May 19th is Malcolm X's birthday, or as we call it around the B1, Malcolm X Day. See, we aren't in the habit of allowing white supremacists to tell us when we can celebrate our heroes and sheroes, when we're supposed to be actually celebrating our own culture, our own people. We choose that for ourselves. And by the way, that's not something that came from me necessarily. I actually was inspired to do this because of Dr. Joseph Ben-Jochannan, bless him. He said as black people, we're not supposed to be asking for a day, you take a day. And he was absolutely right. We're not supposed to be sitting here begging anyone for what is ours. Our ability to actually hold up our own culture, hold up our own icons, that's supposed to be coming from us against any odds. That's how you know you've got a culture. And that's how you know that your culture is vital and that it's pulling you forward and that your culture means something. If Malcolm was here, do you think he'd be telling us to lobby Congress for a day in his honor? Do you think that's what his advice to us would be? Do you think that he would be telling us, you guys need to go and stand behind some wrinkled racist who is fighting for segregation like Joe Biden? Go ahead and smile while this idiot pretends as if he likes having black people around him. And meanwhile, that's how we got so-called Black History Month. These white supremacists deliberately chose the shortest and coldest month of the year. It was their way to give us the middle finger. And the thing about it is, while we could not stop them from doing something like that, we don't have to accept it. See, we need to figure out at some point that we don't need anyone's permission to celebrate ourselves. We need to think and act for ourselves, just like Malcolm did. The lesson of Malcolm's life is that there's no substitute for standing on your own 2 feet. Nobody's going to give you permission to do it either. And when you do, nobody's going to congratulate you for it. Quite the opposite. When Malcolm finally stood up for himself and spoke his own words, the whole world tried to beat him into submission. But he wasn't going. We don't need any racist mayor or governor or legislative body to recognize our shining prince. We're supposed to have enough pride and intelligence to do it ourselves. That is how you have a people who are worthy of their heroes. They're not waiting for their oppressors to take the resources that they have, resources that they stole from us, and then put those resources behind doing what is right on our behalf. A group of people who are oppressed are supposed to realize that their very existence, the fact that they continue to strive and to fight just to breathe another breath, that is an act of rebellion and defiance against the oppressor class. And it's an act of continued defiance that the oppressors not only dislike, but also want to stomp out of existence. And you know what? Malcolm taught us that we're supposed to make the most of that. We're not supposed to sit here being passive. Part of standing up for ourselves is standing up for those who stood for us. People like Malcolm are our heroes. It's our duty, our privilege, and our glory to celebrate them on our own terms. And the reason that I started this little celebration with Malcolm's quote in particular is because as the black media, we came into existence precisely because of the unvarnished racism of the white media. They have been telling a nonstop litany of lies, and we rose up to tell the truth. Malcolm spilled it out when nobody else was willing to even say it because they were all terrified. Well, the white media's not going to bring me on. Malcolm didn't care if they did or didn't. When he showed up, the truth was going to be spoken no matter who didn't like it. We revealed the propaganda measures used by the enemy, just like he did. We expose how they censor, twist, and misrepresent the facts so as to demonize us and whitewash these white supremacists, just like he did. That's how you smarten the people up. You let them know the game that's being run against them. Put it in practical terms so people can recognize how these white supremacist measures are used against them in day-to-day life, so they can recognize it when they see it. See, when Malcolm was alive, that's when you had people saying, make it plain. That's one of the things they would say to Malcolm frequently. Make it plain, brother, make it plain. That's what we do. We make it plain. Because evil is plain. It ain't complicated at all. Oh, the enemy's sophisticated. But the evil they carry out and represent, that is not complicated. This is the lesson of Malcolm's life, and so many people who tried to stand against it, they're gone, disgraced, forgotten. But Malcolm, he's still here in every way that matters. He is still with us. And those who stood against him, those who thought to themselves that by sucking up to white supremacy, they were going to secure themselves a permanent place somehow, they failed. They always do. And that, I believe, is the greatest testament to Malcolm. He has withstood the test of time. Even though the man has been gone for decades now, his message, his memory still endures. Meanwhile, every bootlick, every suck-up, every backstabber, every Uncle Tom, who called themselves showing out for white supremacy, they were going to wag their finger at Malcolm and tell him how wrong he was. These people, they're laughed at. Even the very white media and these white supremacists in the society who were trying to give those fools a pat on the back, even they can't pretend as if any of them were heroes or icons. Because the entire purpose of propping up those sock puppets was precisely because they were trying to use some black person with a requisite amount of melanin as nothing more than a clumsy front for what was an anti-black agenda, but they were readily recognized. You were not going to be able to out-debate Malcolm because Malcolm didn't debate. He simply explained to you why you're wrong. And you couldn't come back with anything. You couldn't deny it. These Negro frontmen were completely and thoroughly useless against the truth that Malcolm stood for. And so the defamation campaign had to be stepped up a notch. The white media, realizing that his bootlicks were completely and thoroughly ineffective, they decided, okay, I guess we got to do this one ourselves. So they brought in Mike Wallace, of all people, and he decided to make what was going to be an unvarnished hit piece, The Hate That Hate Created. Oh yeah, it's a matter of, we're just going to go ahead and take off the gloves. We're going to say that this guy's a hate monger. Since apparently these Negroes we've sent in, they're not able to sell the soap, we'll just go ahead and come out and say it ourselves. Pairing Malcolm to the very white supremacist who he was fighting against, that was absolutely profane, but that was the entire point of doing it. When the white media lies, they lie big. They have to. But even that high-profile character assassination piece was absolutely useless and meaningless against the titan that was Malcolm. Oh, sure, there are some folks who remember it, a couple of graybeards like myself. But the thing to remember is, we do not revere it. Nobody looks and says, yeah, Mike Wallace, he told it like it was. No. Even that propaganda piece from the white media, it's largely forgotten, relegated to the obscure corners of memory. If I didn't remind you about it, you wouldn't even remember it. Those of you who don't remember it, nobody would even have known that it existed. But Malcolm, we know about him. In truth, the story of Malcolm is the story of his people. In his early years, he went through a fight to actually establish his own identity on his own terms. He tried to find a way to coexist in a society that would never accept him, a society that was created for his oppression. Oh, he did a lot of things trying to make himself acceptable to it. But eventually, the society showed him, no, you're never going to be accepted. And after a while, he made it very clear, you know what, even if you had, I wouldn't want it. When he had a chance to have some cultural privacy, if you will, he looked at himself and asked, what kind of man am I? Who am I? And that was the beginning of a personal revolution. That was the beginning of a truly self-made man. Sure, we came out of the slave fields, but the thing about it is we have a history far longer, far grander, and far prouder than anything like that. Breaking the chains of slavery is not the totality of our story. Our fight against white supremacy is not going to be the totality of it either. Ultimately, we will leave white supremacy in the ash heap of history. That is what we're in the process of doing now. Yes, it's a long struggle, but when you're dealing with forces that are this deeply entrenched, what, do you think it's going to be toppled in 30 minutes or less? No. We're in this for the long haul. We're in a fight. We know that. And it's taken a toll on us. So much of our circumstances are totally out of our hands. We have so many racists who control the levers of power outside of the community. And inside the community, we've got so many bootlicks, sellouts, and plain dusty dudes around us. The aggregate result of this is we have a people who have experienced a profound amount of confusion, and has also manifested itself as declining faith in our future and even ourselves. Malcolm went through the same things too. That crisis of character, but that's what ultimately reveals whether you've got character or not. Because no matter what happens to us, we refuse to give up just like he did. Surrender is not an option. Malcolm could have given in. He could have either said, I quit, white supremacy will never be toppled, or he could have done like so many others and try to make common cause with the enemy. With Malcolm's razor-sharp mind and his unparalleled oratorical skills, he could have very easily made himself a valuable mouthpiece for the white media. Wouldn't that have been something? But Malcolm made a promise to himself a long time ago to be true to himself. And telling lies, no matter how big the paycheck, that simply wasn't part of the plan. That was what he wanted to impart to his people. Yes, the enemy may seem to have certain creature comforts, but ultimately the enemy lives in mortal fear. He lives in mortal fear of you and me. Why is that? Because he knows that his creature comforts are no substitute for the fact that he has no real substance. His entire empire is a house of cards, simply waiting for the day when we gain enough strength to topple it and knock it down. So, as Malcolm explained it, from outside the community, they use their white media in order to put on TV shows and books and movies that are showing you a fairy tale, non-existent version of America that's supposed to be colorblind, and black folks are sitting down next to non-black folks and it's all kumbaya. That's the propaganda that the white media shows you from the outside. And from the inside, they send in their paid and bought for bootlicks. These fork-tongued liars who come amongst us and tell us white supremacy is not going to fall. You just need to get used to it. Try to get the best deal you can for yourself. Oh, just forget about all that stuff. White supremacy believes in taking both sides of the conversation, trying to appeal to your sense of, well, if only there would be some Pollyanna-ish vision of the world. Oh, wouldn't that be nice? And at the same time, trying to undermine morale from within. But Malcolm called these tactics out decades ago. This is nothing new. He talked about how everything from movies to even comic books are all geared toward trying to get you to buy into the idea that you can be part of white supremacy somehow, put under their banners somehow. Things ain't changed. We have overcome so much as a people, but because the enemy has a half a millennium head start, we find ourselves with a long way to go. But we can do it, because we must. Yes, there are going to be setbacks and setups along the way. We're in a treacherous world because it's defined by our enemies. But even in our condition, we've managed to influence things for the better. The goal now is to make sure that the material gains come to and remain in our hands. That's the fight that we're currently waging, a true struggle for power. And the winner of that struggle is not going to come down to who has more people, or come down to who is willing to yell the loudest. It's going to come down to willpower. Who is willing to hang in there all the way to the end. And that is why we must remember Malcolm. As Dr. John Henrik Clarke said, bury the man and continue the plan. And so that's what we're doing. It's times like these when we need to remember that we have lost our way before. But more importantly than that, we found our way before. We have the ability to do that. And we don't need anybody else to show us the way. We've got more than enough intelligence and more than enough strength of character to find it on our own. Yes, Malcolm's life does parallel our own age in many ways. See, the rise of the black media came after 15 some odd years of scammers and fools making a mockery of the work of the Grandmaster teachers. What passed for discourse within the black community had become not just a dumpster fire, it had become a toilet. We had idiocy ranging from fools who were standing in front of a chalkboard pretending to imitate the Grandmaster teachers when all they were teaching was a bunch of empty-headed people to see them as some sort of object for some easy loving. That's what they were doing, using those settings as a clumsy front to try to get themselves some easy affection. All the way to utter madness like the Kundalini nonsense. And you had other people who were just slamming their gums for no reason at all. See, these shea butter clowns, they came out of that particular time period, the turn of the 21st century. Somehow our discourse had fallen from the lofty heights of Dr. Clarke, Dr. Ben, and Dr. Cress Welsing to the sewer of the fools who had taken over in the years of the so-called new millennium. But then again, we've been here before. You go back to the turn of the 20th century, when Malcolm came of age. Our history had been thoroughly and completely suppressed. You couldn't even teach about slavery in American schools back then. That's the environment that the Nation of Islam arose out of. Truth be told, even though they are a religious organization, when you talk to them, especially in those early decades, they were mostly a historical preservation society. That's what they were doing, teaching the history. That's what they did, reminding black people about the fact that our very birth names are not our own. They came from our oppressors. And they also taught us we need to start rejecting the trappings of white supremacy. When you reject the things that came from the oppressor, You're rejecting the oppressor himself. And when you do that, you work to disempower the oppressor. That's how liberation actually works in the real world. When you've taken it upon yourself that you're going to devalue the things that come from white supremacy, well, at that point, you've given yourself permission to do anything to white supremacy that you want. You can mock it, you can disregard it, you can destroy it. We are blessed that so much of what we take for granted as the underpinnings of intelligent black conversation were put in place by people like Malcolm. When Malcolm came on the scene, so much of what is common knowledge today was forbidden knowledge back then. That's why when he talked about it, it was such a revelation to people. They truly hadn't heard it before. They definitely didn't hear it from a black man who clearly knew what he was talking about. After the end of chattel slavery, black people began building in this country, but the white supremacists systematically destroyed our townships and reestablished the old order, only under different names. What had been openly talked about during Reconstruction was now no longer allowed. That was the environment into which Malcolm was born. So you see, there's more than a little parallel between his life and our current age. We've been here before, with our people having been led astray by the enemy and their minions, or as Malcolm called it, bamboozled. We've had our own intellectual dark age inflicted on us by the enemy, and we've also had people fighting to pull our minds out of the muck, to raise our mentality out of the darkness and into the light. That process, however, begins with unplugging from the white media and turning to each other. The white media doesn't bring you anything for the sake of informing you. They bring you things for, at best, infotainment, a bunch of meaningless fluff that has nothing to do with nothing, but it is a distraction that keeps you from doing the work you're supposed to be doing. And at worst, they bring you a whole bunch of disinformation that is meant to get you to fight against your own interests. Learn to recognize the tactics that the enemy employs, and get used to making sure that you have other black people on code. A code cannot merely be a set of rules, it also has to be enforced. And one of those rules is, we have to make sure we celebrate ourselves. We have to make sure that we stand up for those who stood up for us. And that's why we do this. We celebrate Malcolm because he fought for us before most of us were even born. We celebrate Malcolm because he fought the battle back when it was the hardest. We celebrate Malcolm because he held our values and he did it practically when most black people didn't want to do it at all. We celebrate Malcolm because he spoke truth to power. He called it by its name and didn't care who didn't like it. We celebrate Malcolm because he provided a living example of unapologetic blackness. So on this day, we do what he told us to do. We exercise our own free will. We think and act and speak for ourselves. And we use our voice to salute our shining prince. Malcolm didn't die at all. As long as we remember him and live out his principles, then he is alive and well.